Welcome back to the second of our transfer grade podcasts. Today, we're going to talk about how Chelsea's transfer window was a disaster. So make sure you listen to the end to hear our thoughts on what is possibly the worst window for any club in many years. We're grading 5 teams in alphabetical order on this episode, and we'll start with Palace and their head-scratching decision not to cash in the big cash that Newcastle allegedly offered for Marc Guehi in what was otherwise a pretty good window. Then Everton's poor window goes along with the lackluster start to the season. It's obviously fueled a little bit by the uncertainty behind the ownership group, so you got to grade them on a bit of a curve. Next comes Fulham, who sold João Palhinha to Bayern Munich, so great sales for Fulham. But we asked some questions about how they reinvested that money. And finally, before we go two-footed on Chelsea, we touch on Ipswich's risky transfer strategy and how it sets them up for the future, even if they get relegated. Enjoy this one. It was fun. Greetings and welcome to another episode of the Transfer Flow podcast. My name is Ted Knutson. I'm joined by our regular guest, Ravi Ramaneni. Today, we are talking about part 2 of our transfer grades for the Premier League. We have a deep background in assessing players and transfer markets over the past decade, and we also have no fear about criticizing people that do really bad jobs over the summertime. For the most part, in our first episode, we were pretty kind. We felt like the league has gotten a lot smarter over the course of this year. Today, we are going to be a little more balanced in some of the criticism. And for those of you who are Chelsea fans who are a little frustrated this summer, you'll be very excited about it. For those of you who are Chelsea fans that are really excited about this summer, you'll be less excited about it. And for those of you who are not Chelsea fans, you will be fucking delighted about what we have to say today.
Yeah. Hi, Ted. Happy to be back.
Welcome. So we're going to start somewhere that's not Chelsea, but down in far South London. I don't feel like it's really London, by the way, but that's a different topic for a different day. We're going to start down in Crystal Palace. Crystal Palace had an interesting summer, a long rumor about Marc Guehi going up to Newcastle. They did manage to sell Michael Olise to Bayern Munich via a release clause, which I think sort of hurt their attack a little bit because he's a very good attacker. But what did you think of their overall window?
I think it was an interesting one. I think I gave an overall grade of B for them, their window. First of all, if what we heard was right towards the end of the window that Marc Guehi was at 70 and they didn't accept 70 and they went to 75, that could be wrong. But if that is the case, I would say maybe that's a missed opportunity.
Timing your sales is actually a very critical skill, and it's partly about negotiation. You're staring down somebody else for, an extra few £1 million. But also at a certain point, once it gets like a really large number, like, look, we got to take that money. They're making like a £30 million mistake here. Let's go.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that to me sort of put a dent in the whole, for me, like their outbounds especially. But I think they still got good money for Olise, which while they, while it was a clause triggering, but still I think that, they got good money for him. I do think the 2 centerbacks they signed, Maxence Lacroix and
Chadi Riyad.
I think they are both. I think if you look at their age profile, I would say I like those signings at the prices they've signed.
I felt like Riyad was peanuts. And they also brought in Trevor Chalobah as a depth signing for a loan. And I'm sure that he's got some playing time attached to it, but that seemed like a good one as well. I think it's easy, like contextually, Crystal Palace, I think we both like Glasner, right? Like we think Glasner's a pretty talented, youngish coach. Their style is interesting to watch. They have a lot of physicality in there. They have 1 or 2 pieces that I think don't fit as well as they need to. Like I watched Will Hughes play this weekend. Will Hughes seemed a little slow and a little out of place in that group versus everything else. But that is to say that, they're still Crystal Palace. So like you're not expecting perfection from them. And I think in recent seasons, they've done quite a good job at not only taking what was a very old squad in the early days under Roy Hodgson and revamping them to be a team that feels like it shouldn't be in too much relegation risk. But they also have some nice upside and some good talent that comes in regularly.
Yeah, and I think they've added Matt Turner from on loan.
There's this funny little dance that gets done almost every end of transfer window where people realize that they haven't actually covered their backup goalkeeper slot in the way that they needed to. And so you see a lot of loans that are, you're like, is he good?
Yeah.
Nobody really knows, but hopefully he doesn't have to play that much. And if he does, well, he's probably not a disaster. I think Marco Bettinelli was the last one I remember being like, oh, don't sign that dude. He can't stop anything.
Yeah. And what do you think of their sale of Joachim Andersen to Fulham?
I think that was mostly a squad redevelopment sale. Andersen has been an ever-present pretty much. He's put a lot of miles in. 28 years old, though, so perfectly fine. The fee is good, and they felt like either they had already done the work to replace him early on, or they weren't bothered with losing him. So I think that's a good sale. The Olisa numbers are good. I think the big question and almost determining factor of how this window turns out is like, what are they going to get out of Eddie Nketiah?
Yeah, I think that one, that's one of the big questions for them. Like, I think in Arsenal he played a specific role, and I think even last season it changed from what he used to be, like a box striker. Early on, he was he's just around 6-yard box. I think our old friend Orbinho used to tweet these facts about him, about how many shots he's taken from inside the 6-yard box or around there. So, obviously last year he was a lot more pressing. I think you could see the difference in his output. So it'll be interesting to see how they will use him here.
The reason why I like this deal for them is like when Nketiah was in the English national teams, and people like Dominic Solanke were those types of guys in the past as well. He was one of the sort of biggest scorers that they've ever seen. I think that putting him in sort of the Arsenal / Mikel Arteta Pep system might have impacted a little bit of his ability to score goals, right? Like he had different responsibilities, a little less freedom. It might be an interesting question, and I think is one that Palace are gambling on. If you put him in a team that has a different structure and you let him do what he was really, really good at as a younger player, can he succeed, especially as he gets, another year or two under his belt? And I feel a little optimistic about that, given the patterns that we've seen among other players that have done that before. So for me, I feel like 25 million plus some add-ons is a perfectly fine price. And I think that overall Palace had a very solid window. I think that this is, it's probably an A-. They didn't have any big fuck ups, and they brought in, they had good sales and they brought in enough guys that seemed like solid replacements. They also set themselves up for next summer too. So if they want to get rid of Guehi at a good price, like they're ready to rock and they'll be all over their needs. We're gonna wait on Chelsea until the end, just to let people sit on that, marinate. We'll get there. Go ahead.
One last bit about Palace is that they got 5 million for Jordan Ayew.
Yeah, amazing. Who gets an Ayew money in this market? It seems impossible.
Yeah. So we go next to Everton then.
Everton. We're going to go into the poor end of the transfer window and the poor end of the Premier League right now.
Yeah. I feel like this is a club in trouble. I mean, that's an understatement, with not only on field but off field, with the ownership and change of ownership, groups coming in to buy them, but they're backing out because of what they saw in the books and what they saw they'll be on the hook for. It's not looking good for them off the field, and even on the field they look pretty. They gave up a 2-0 lead in the 87th minute this past weekend.
That was insane. And they gave it up off of 3 plays that were almost identical, like 3 goals that were just carbon copied, but image inverted, where far post crosses, somebody finishes over the back of a washed fullback, or just like an open spot on the far post. You could just imagine Sean Dyche like chewing gravel and spitting it at each of the guys that gave up the goals in the locker room after the game.
Yeah. I think that if you go look into their ins and outs, I thought that there was a whole drama about Jarrad Branthwaite being sold at the beginning of the window as one of those left-footed center backs, and we had a special edition talking about left-footed center backs, and he was one of the guys we profiled, and he was supposed to be going out for big money, but in the end that didn't happen. Instead, they got Jake O'Brien. I think that's probably the tallest center back pairing right now that they have in all of Premier League.
He's not starting though, is he? Like it's like Tarkowski and somebody, right? And
yeah. When they made the deal, I was like, oh, Sean Dyche wants to field the tallest center back pairing in the league. I think I'm interested about Ilman Ndiaye. It's an interesting signing for me.
I like that one too.
Yeah. And and then the other one, obviously they got good value for Amadou Onana going out. So it's within the league to Aston Villa, but I think it was good price. Yeah, I think overall it's hard to separate their window struggles. It felt like towards the end they tried to get some players in, they couldn't. And it's one of those because of all the uncertainty at the board level. I think they couldn't take these decisions soon enough to be able to close some of these. You could see that. I'm sure Sean Dyche is frustrated.
When you don't know what your budget looks like, it's really hard to commit to spending money on players. They have a loan of Armando Broja, who was allegedly going to go to Ipswich, but then had an Achilles problem. There's a buy option there. They got a bunch of other loans just to fill out the squad. Asmir Begovic is probably not good enough to start most places, but he's there as well. I think one of the things that's like, there's two really truly telling indicators about the quality of the squad. And this has been a club that was mismanaged for a very long time. In fact, like I used to get abuse online for saying that like these overpays for like 30 million, slightly underwhelming wide forwards that they were doing that were mostly crossy guys. Oh, it'll never come back to bite Everton because they've never been outside of the Premier League. Well, when you do that enough times and you have like players from Turkey that you spend 25 or 30 million pounds on when, that was real money back in the day, and they wash out as a starting forward, like you do that enough times and you just flush a bunch of money down the toilet and then you have no real money to reinvest in the squad. And this like goes beyond ownership problems into just like very poorly managed squads for the course of pretty much a decade. Basically, since Moyes left, there's been ups and downs, but mostly downs and mostly bad management. Now we're looking at this team and it's threadbare. They have Tim Iragbunam playing midfield right from the start when you're like, man, I no one should do that, right? Like he might get some minutes to like season him, but like they'd have nobody else to be able to play that spot. So the midfield's totally bare. And they put two fullbacks on contract that are 38 or 39 years old and 35 years old for Coleman. They should be nowhere near the Premier League. Nowhere near the Premier League. They're not remotely good enough. They haven't been good enough for who knows how long. Like probably early in their 30s might have been the best case that they were like average Premier League players, but probably not, to be honest with you. Maybe that's cruel on Ashley Young just because he's so old. That he was all right early in his 30s, but that was 7 years ago. Anyway, like they are in real trouble. I thought the outgoings were good, but you have to grade them on a curve because who the hell knows what the ownership situation is. And so this isn't beating them up and beating the people that run the club up about what the jobs that they've done. They're doing probably a perfectly fine job in incredibly difficult circumstances. It's just long-term irresponsible ownership and bad management from people that came before that are now coming back to really bite the team this year. Sean Dyche, who I think actually is quite a good head coach and has done a good job for a long time. He's a challenging personality, but I think he's good at the coaching side of it. He's got every bit of his work cut out for him this year.
Yeah, totally. I think my overall grade was a C+ for them.
Yeah, I think it's higher than that just because of how difficult it is to construct in that particular set of terms. I felt bad about potentially being meaner than I am, but also like, what the hell are Seamus Coleman and Ashley Young doing on that team? They should be coaches, Ravi. They should graduate into the next phase of their careers.
Yeah.
All right, Fulham. What do we have to say about one of the posh areas of London?
For me, I think they did a great job getting 50 million plus for João Palhinha. That seemed like one where a coach from the league or that's very well aware of the league. Oh, I like that player, and you know, I need the player wherever I go.
They almost
Type
let the
of thing.
bag slip, though. They almost didn't get that deal done at the eye-watering prices that were talked about, and you're like, no, don't screw that up.
Yeah, yeah, and I thought they used the money pretty well. You know, from that in terms of Emile Smith-Rowe, I think is a good signing for them, even though he hasn't played much role for Arsenal in the past 2 years, especially in the league. I think you put him in the attacking midfield role in Fulham. I think he would be very good there. I expect him to be very good there. I thought that was a very good signing. Joachim Andersen, again, we talked about him on the flip side with Crystal Palace. I think at 28, you know, Fulham is replacing Tim Ream, who was 36. And
are we really going to give them full credit for replacing a 36-year-old with a 28-year-old?
You know, center backs. I think center backs, I would, if there is a position, not talking about goalkeepers, but in the outfield, if there is a position where I'll be okay with slightly older players, I think center back is one. So I mean, but
in the Premier
point,
League, are you still comfortable with that? That's my question. Like in most leagues, yeah, you might be comfortable with the aging process. So for those of you who aren't aware of how age curves work, like in adult males, testosterone peaks around age 25. And particularly in explosive endeavors, which is very much the Premier League, although different positions have different levels of explosiveness that are required. Most of the age curve centers around age 25. In some cases, it actually goes on the early ends of that. And in some cases, as Ravi mentions, like some of them have a longer, more gentle aging curve. They might have a longer plateau in it. I do think that certainly 28 is the end of peak. And in fact, like I tend to be a little aggressively earlier than that, although most people will claim that, you know, 28 is a comfortable spot. I'm like, if anybody's signing a 28-year-old, they're definitely on the back half of that trajectory. Now, this varies on a player-by-player basis. So we're talking about averages. We're talking about what you understand from players. And the thing that is interesting about the players that you currently own or you own their contracts is that you have their stats, you have their physical stats. So you have really good information about how they're aging and what is happening on the pitch for them. The outsider does not have that. And so there's a risk factor involved in it. I think that we thought in general, we agreed that their outgoings were very good, very well done. I think Kim and I are a little more cautious than you are on those incomings.
Yeah. I mean, I think that one other thing to add to your point about age curves is also players and positions that depend a lot on those high-end outputs like accelerations and speeds, and players that depend on it. Like someone like Santi Cazorla is different from like let's say a Yankuba Minte, who's probably probably not a great comparison because of the age difference, but still like someone that depends more on his technique and guile versus someone that's more dependent on his pace.
And some super elite players age very gracefully, like a Giggs aged very gracefully. Although, you know, Giggs will admit to anybody that listens to him that at one point he could no longer run full speed. He could never run full speed because he knew he'd tear his hamstrings again. And so he built a career off of running at about 80%. But the one that I think in current days that is still incredible is Kyle Walker. Like Kyle Walker is, first of all, he's one of the best fullbacks the Premier League's ever seen. Second of all, he's one of the fastest players that has played defense and over like a really long period of time. It feels like his career should have mostly wrapped up a few years ago, but you watch him and his outputs are still great and he's still a good defender. So, you know, it does vary on a player-by-player basis. Ravi is correct in that center backs do have a more lenient curve or a longer plateau. Smith, so here's I think where Kim and I landed on this, like independently. So we do all of our transfer grades independently. We don't talk to each other about them while we're doing them because it avoids groupthink for the most part. And so Smith-Rowe, given what you know about him, it felt like Fulham overpaid by about 5 to 7 million. Like that would have been a fine deal at 20 million with some add-ons, but at 27, you know, they didn't need to pay that. Like you could have been more aggressive. Like how many other suitors were there? Joachim Andersen maybe there. Maybe they could have gotten a slightly cheaper price given the age, given that he's only coming from Palace, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that Fulham definitely needed to do though was they needed to get younger this window. They had one of those aging squads. And one of the danger points for Premier League teams in particular is if you get well outside of peak age range in the minutes played, like you run more risk of being a potential relegation candidate for a medium or smaller size team. It is a consistent pattern for the most part that we see. Sander Berge is another one where I wanted to like this one. And I wanted to like this one because I have history. Like we all have darlings that we've reviewed in the past in a transfer space. I really liked Sander Berge coming out of Belgium. I liked him coming out of Genk. I thought that he was able to potentially be a midfield dynamo somewhere else. And, you know, with good passing range and just like the type of player that comes out and you're like, oh, he can do all the things. And he's got physical gifts as well. And it turns out that, like, for whatever reason, he hasn't shown elements of that. The question, as Ravi correctly noted earlier in one of our pods, is that sometimes these players will do better in a better team. But are we sure that that's going to be the case? And are we sure that Fulham are going to be that better team? So yeah, I think that, you know, Kim and I were a bit more cautious about the incomings. You ended up with a B+. I had a C for the incomings. I thought it was a very average window, nothing special about it. And our overall grade for Fulham was still a B because the outgoings were really good. So Ipswich we can quickly cover, and then we'll tuck in with Chelsea as a wrap. What did you think of Ipswich's window?
I think one of the first parts we talked about Ipswich, how they needed to completely overhaul the roster to play in the Premier League, which I think they tried to do. I think they spent a lot of money. But I look at it, a lot of these players are players that have coming from Championship or relegated teams from the Premier League that have good seasons, especially the guys coming from the Championship that had good seasons. So I am definitely a little skeptical about their window. And, you know, okay, like you have to give some credit to, you know, Kieran McKenna, who got 2 promotions in 2 seasons and you know, like, so there is definitely some amount of confidence in him, but I still think that this roster, I'm not sure. Calvin Phillips, I think is an intriguing addition if he can rekindle his form from years ago before he joined City. I think that could be a really good addition, albeit on a loan. Ipswich, when they were in the Championship, they were one of the their games were one of the most entertaining games because they had the highest number of goals, second highest by 1 goal, goals scored in their games, for and against. Mm-hmm. So I almost think that they can't replicate that in the Premier League where they will score a lot of goals. So they need to get.
You don't want to be an underdog and have high-paced games at the same time. Like that very rarely works out well for you.
Yeah. So I think that's. So if you're talking about XG, they gave up about 1 XG or 0.95 XG per game in the Championship and scored about 1.5 XG. So, you know, that almost is gonna the XG4 is gonna deflate and the XG against is gonna inflate in the Premier League, right? So that's not a good sign. So I'm not very sure about like this whole their entire window. Like there are some players that I like, but it does seem like for me that it's still a very good Championship side playing in the Premier League with a few players, with a few exceptions.
So there's about 100 million plus pounds of revenue per year, a difference in the TV deal between the League One, where I think you get about 2.2, and the Premier League, plus all of the other additions and add-ons and the sellouts that you get from Tractor Boys, etc. Maybe Ed Sheeran is paying more money and happy to invest because he's a longtime fan and he actually has been supporting the club on the front of their shirt for a long time too. It's useful apparently to make, I don't know, 500 million, £500 million out of every other tour that you do. Maybe we'll see Taylor Swift get involved in ownership at some sport someday. See, we've mentioned Taylor. Now the algorithm's going to kick us way up. Anyway, back to Ipswich. I think that I have been in this position before where I was looking at potentially needing to take a very weak squad and build them for the Premier League. And I think that it's kind of an impossible spot. And because the budget just doesn't work, so you're stuck in you know, stick or twist mode. And you have three options. One, you can overspend and try and stay up and hope that you get there, right? You can, and maybe the players come and maybe they don't. Like, it's actually difficult to get players to come into a team that's just been promoted out of the championship that are good, like really good. If you've been there for a few years, then they're like, oh yeah, probably, especially if you're not in a bad place geographically. The second way to do it is the way that Luton did it last year, which is basically take the money and run. We're going to go up. We're not really going to compete to stay up because the money is so valuable in giving us better infrastructure for the long term that that's what we're going to use it for. And I respect that choice immensely. It is so hard for so many owners to be able to make that choice, but it's the right one for certain teams because you just don't have the infrastructure. You got a bit lucky. I think Huddersfield were the last team that I remember that sort of were around that way. I visited them after they got promoted, and they had a Huddersfield branded espresso machine, and they were upgrading like a training pitch. And that was basically where a lot of their money was going toward. The final way is what Ipswich did, and I really respect this. They basically decided that we're going to give ourselves a chance this year. We're going to take some bit of risky, as you mentioned, like some risky transfers. But if they pay off, and we've got a really good coach, we might be able to sneak in 17th.
Yeah,
that's what we're going for. But if they don't pay off and we go down, awesome, because we're going to be really good now. Like we're not a League One squad. We're going to be, bottom tier Premier League squad. That's what we're going to go for right here. And so what they've done is they've given them a buffer against a future relegation. They've given themselves a chance for future promotion. And they didn't spend that much on any particular one set of players. If one or two of these guys spike in the Premier League, they paid for their whole window anyway. That's what I look at here. And I know that it might not pay off, but this level of calculated gambling is something that fits in my blood and my DNA from my whole career. And so in that way, I really respect this. And I think they had a good window.
Yeah, I think we're probably a little differ on this. I think I looked at it more as like, are they building a roster for the Premier League? But I think your point is valid. Like, they're not looking at it just like, well, we have to survive at any cost, but we're going to just take a chance. And if we don't survive, then we will go into championship very strong. I think, I think that makes sense.
West Ham and Newcastle, and to some extent Villa's incredible overspending when they were down in the championship, allowed them to be able to do that in a very different way. I just don't think that's in Ipswich's bag of clubs, and so they had to be a little careful about it. The outgoings here are possibly the funniest that exists in the Premier League this year. It's like, yeah, we really did come up from League One. We're not selling anybody because we got nobody to sell, and we're actually letting a bunch of these old dudes go. But thank you very much for your service. Well done, gentlemen.
Yeah, no, I couldn't give a grade for them for outbounds because there just weren't any to mention. Yeah.
But let's let everybody that's bad go on a free because we didn't have long-term contracts for them. And let's just restock across the board because that's necessary. All right, so let's move on to possibly the most interesting transfer team of the summer, Chelsea. Would you like to start, sir?
Well, I mean, you could say the past couple of summers.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's honestly, this one took more time to break down, try to analyze, and not just say
to simply read the list, Ravi. It took more time to read the list.
No, you could have just, this is one of those where I felt like, well, I don't need to do this. I could just put a grade, like a bad grade for them and just be done with it, right? Because we've heard about them so much and we've also covered them a lot in the podcast. So it's something that that's there. But then, you have to do the due diligence of just like what you did for other teams.
You got to respect the work. You got to respect yourself.
Yes. The biggest issue for me is that I'm talking about the incomings right now. The biggest issue for me is they didn't add anybody that bursts out as like, oh, this guy is going to start, take this position, make his own. Maybe
João Felix is on the edge of that if he comes correct.
Yeah, I guess they also have Pedro Neto. And so that's the one that they spent the most money on this window, but that doesn't mean that he's a starter. But that to me is like, if you spend close to 200 or 150 million across the board, I think it's close to 200. You want to add a couple of players that are going to come and take spots and make difference, difference makers, game changers, whatever you want to call it. I don't think they added anybody like that. So they had this huge roster of good, young, with a lot of potential type players, and they added a few more of those same type players. And now you have a bigger roster, but still nothing, like you haven't really improved that much other than having more players. Now you have to send more players on loan.
Isn't more players better? More players is always better, especially if you're a head coach. He loves more players. Give me 35. That's awesome. Let me work with 35.
Yeah, he's gonna probably have to work on two pitches.
What about the 3-11? Yeah, you just like keep the third 11. You just cycle them across. Like people can take a break. That's how football works.
Yeah, one of the ideas I had, crazy ideas I was thinking about, was during the window was they might actually they can actually field a completely different 11 home games and away games, and have like introduce some new revolution into football. Talk about load management. There you go.
It's like the cup goalkeeper, except for just home and away. Like just 19 games for you, 19 games for you. Nobody gets injured. We're good. We'll just lock it up.
We'll just lock it up. Yeah. So I think, and the other thing that I've heard, I think Ryan O'Hanlon also had a kind of a piece around where, Chelsea is being operated like a investment fund, or like, I don't think I think he was critical about it. So for me, like investment funds and, football teams differ in one fundamental way, is that in an investment fund, if you have 10 companies in your portfolio, all 10 of them have a full field to operate, and they are all working independently. Like I don't think but then in football, if you only have in a season, you have 38 games. And if you add other competitions, you have maybe another 15, 20 more. So you have about 60 games, and you have 11 players can play each game, and players' value goes down if they don't play. They also are not going to be sharp. So here now you're talking about, there's a lot of interdependency on if one of your, let's keeping the portfolio thing analogy going. If your portfolio, only 10 players or 11 players are going to get the opportunity to shine, other players won't be able to. So now it's not the same comparison, and so you're losing value. Moreover, you're paid top dollar to get these 40 players, and putting them on loan at a lower league or a smaller league is not the same.
No, it's not the same. And you don't have control over their training environment necessarily. Like maybe if they're at Strasbourg, but we've seen lots of multi-club groups have real difficulty even when they've tried to control the difference between the two. Like Red Bull might be the best group that is closest to that ideal across a couple teams. They have 12 years or something of being involved in that at this point, and still have had choppiness. I think the other thing that you talk about is like some of these are inversely correlated bets. So if you're a gambler or you're a hedge fund manager, like you need to be a little bit careful about stocking your portfolio with things that are going to negatively impact your alpha or your gain, or even your beta if you're saying young players are just going to improve alongside of each other. Because like if one goes up, then the other one goes down. So it ruins and that's what you're talking about. Like if players are not getting minutes, and minutes are actually a resource, and this is something that many owners don't understand, and plenty of directors of football seem to misunderstand. Minutes are a resource. High quality minutes, high quality competitive minutes are a constant resource. Training minutes are a resource. And there's only so many of those to go around. Attention from great coaches is a resource. Again, if they're not getting it, if it's deteriorating that, then that impacts the likelihood that your investments are going to continue to improve. On a case-by-case basis, I want to go back through this. We've got a little bit of time before Ravi has to disappear. If I told you that a player had a patellar fracture, so a pretty significant knee injury, supposed to take 6 months, he came back in 10 after a setback, and that was a few years ago. And then since that time, he's had pretty consistent and significant issues with some muscular tears or some muscular sort of injuries. Would you be willing to pay like a sizable transfer fee for that player?
Probably not.
No, that's a huge red flag. For everybody that understands how transfers work, you are very, very interested in their injury history. You're interested in their playing time. And was their playing time impacted by injury? Was it by coach's decision? Or was it simply that they had great players in front of them and they hadn't had a chance to break through? If it's by injury, like you are steering very, very clear of large transfer fees because the risk is very negative and the likelihood it pays off is probably negative.
Yeah, totally agree with that.
So that's Pedro Neto. and as good as he might look on the pitch, they signed him till 2031. You sign an injury-prone player till 2031? What the fuck are you doing? Like, there's no possible way that makes sense. None whatsoever. Nobody makes sense.
I mean, they talk a lot about how they use the trick of amortization as if it's not something people haven't known all this time. The problem with that is you could do that for a window, and then after that, a lot of your budget is going in the amortization of older deals, like which is what's going to happen from next season.
Yeah, and there's no liquidity in the market, right? Like especially for bad players. Like we're not seeing. They're also giving players that are pretty good raises. So like you're not locked in on these low tier deals. Like you're giving guys raises to keep them happy. But I don't know. It is as risky as I've seen from a big club that wasn't someone like Barcelona, who felt like they had infinite levers they could pull. And Barcelona have certainly mortgaged some of their future as well, but they have a great academy that's managing to produce like a Champions level or world-class level player basically every year right now. Their problem is keeping them on the pitch. They've had injury issues there. I don't know if Barcelona have specific injury issues or if it's a bit of bad luck. For Chelsea, they have also had a great academy. Their window, they undersold some players that were very good. So we felt like Conor Gallagher went for probably 10 to 15 million less than he should have, given the quality of the player, the type of player that he is. He ended up in a great spot. Ian Maatsen, left back, like probably should be part of that group. Levi Colwill is part of the group. Both of those guys came out of the academy. I don't know what the fee on Maatsen was because there's PSR confusion around that. Lewis Hall's a left back. They sold for very good money, so fair enough. Lukaku out for 25 million. Like Lukaku's pretty washed. Like you got to give them full credit on that one. Napoli, on the other hand, deserve to be ridiculed, as we will do in a future one. Hutchinson, again, another fine deal. Some things are going to Saudi, so like they're managing to pick up some sales to Saudi late in the window. Whether those players are good or not, I don't know, but they are sellable assets. Hakim Ziyech and Malang Sarr are both effectively on freeze. Like that's big mismanagement there from fees that were historic ones. So now you're like, all right, do we give them credit for being able to fix these problems in the future? Not really. They have co-sporting directors and a hugely stocked recruitment team. And they didn't manage to get everybody moved out or on loan minutes in effective places before the end of the window, because it's almost an impossibility. There's just too many things going on that you have to pay attention to. Too many players, too many deals that are being made for now or in the future or whatever. Maybe it gets better, but like, man, that's a big leap. That's a set of assumptions that I don't think are possible for anybody in the whole world, no matter how competent they actually are. And at no point has anybody at Chelsea in recent years proven a high level of competence.
Yeah, I mean, your point about assumptions is great. Like, so if you think about it, as you add assumption on top of an assumption, your confidence level or the confidence intervals grow. So the outcomes are now wider, like, you know, and it's they multiply just because it's you're assuming one thing to go right and building on top of that another assumption to go right. It's just like a over leveraging. Maybe there is, among all these assumptions, maybe there's one or two that are actually kind of gonna hit, but then there is probably 3 or 4 that probably are not that likely to happen, and so you end up.
And if it's a chain probability, any break in the chain breaks the whole assumption set.
Yep.
And if you're paying undervalue for these assets, then you might be okay. But if you're paying basically at market value for these players, and they are, because the market understands what's going on, and they're not, the idea that young players will improve into being better players is not a new assumption. But there's also risk involved. Like they're not guaranteed to get better at all. In some cases, we've seen young players that peak at 21, or players that just quit. Like they get a big payday and they're like, yeah, I've had enough. Like I'm just going to see out my contract. I'm going to walk away in the sunset. I like drinking. I like dancing. I like girls. I want to hang out with my friends. Like these are real choices that footballers make too.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think overall, I can't be happy with, I think the outgoings are fine. They probably should have done more. But I think they did okay there. But I think incomings for me is not very good.
Well, I think that the assumption about outgoings and the assumption about their incoming transfer window means they're going to be good at selling players in the future. But if they weren't particularly good at selling the players this time around, why do we assume that they're suddenly going to miraculously get better at selling these assets in the future that may or may not have even development curves around it? It just doesn't work on any sense of the level. Like, they lost their academy manager who was producing great talent on a regular basis. Maybe they'll be fine, but there's so many maybes and so many questions involved in this window that I'm just like, no, absolutely. I'm not going to believe it. I gave him an F on the transfer grade. I think that Kim probably improved that a little bit on the overall to be a D across the space. But at some point, you got to call bullshit on it. And that's where we're at.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think I was probably the most liberal, I guess, compared to you two on this one. But I have inbounds at D and outbounds at B, so I think I gave it an overall C. But yeah, but not a very happy C.
If you like our content, please like, subscribe, give us 5-star reviews on whatever podcast platform you're listening on. And please also, we have very different content in our newsletter. We're at thetransferflow.com/subscribe. Share with your friends. We're growing rapidly. We're industry insider favorite. They like to hear us, call things as we see them. And once again, thank you to everybody for listening. Really appreciate it. For Ravi and myself, we'll catch you next time.